For Daniel Miller, peace had always been a fragile thing. After the bitter collapse of a 6-year marriage and the slow, painful unraveling of friendships that sided with his ex-wife, he moved into the quiet, sun-drenched suburb of Willow Heights to start over. The house he bought wasn't much, modest, with peeling shutters and creaky floorboards, but it came with something he desperately needed, a backyard. Over the next 3 years, that small stretch of earth became Daniel's refuge, his sanctuary, the one place he could reclaim a sense of control. He poured every weekend, every free evening, and every ounce of emotional energy into transforming the space. He tore out the tangled weeds and laid rich, dark soil by hand. He researched native pollinators, composting, and moon phase planting cycles. Slowly, it began to bloom. Lavender bushes stood tall like proud sentinels on either side of the stone path he laid himself, their scent wafting through the open kitchen windows in the early mornings. Rows of cherry tomatoes flourished on neatly trellised vines, their red skin glistening like jewels in the sunlight. Peonies, daisies, and climbing roses danced across the back fence, as if celebrating the rebirth of the space, and perhaps Daniel himself. The garden became more than just a hobby, it was therapy, meditation, rebirth. He found joy in the rhythm of it: dig, water, wait, bloom. Friends began to notice the change in him, how he smiled more and seemed less burdened. Some joked he was dating his garden. Daniel didn't mind. For the first time in years, he could breathe. But peace, he learned, always came at a price, and in Willow Heights, the price was named Karen. Karen Simmons, Daniel's next-door neighbor, was a woman in her late 50s with a permanent scowl etched into her face like a weather-worn statue. Her blonde bob was always stiff with hairspray, and her voice carried across fences like a foghorn in a storm. From the day Daniel moved in, she had made her presence and displeasure known. At first, it was subtle. Disapproving glances as he unloaded flower pots from his car, passive-aggressive comments about all that dirt being tracked around the neighborhood, or the occasional sarcastic observation, "Smells like a forest out here now, doesn't it?" But Daniel, in his quiet and diplomatic way, chose to ignore her. He had faced worse. But Karen's discontent grew in tandem with the garden's blooms. She complained about the bees that buzzed happily around the lavender, claiming they were a hazard to her grandchildren who never actually visited. She griped about the sound of birds that had begun nesting in Daniel's newly hung feeders, as if nature itself were a nuisance. The final straw for her, it seemed, was the jasmine plant Daniel had added near the shared fence. Its sweet perfume drifted gently through the evening air, a scent Daniel found soothing. Karen, however, claimed it gave her migraines. Still, Daniel held his ground. He had broken no rules. The fence line was clearly his. The garden wasn't loud, nor dangerous. It was beautiful. He tried to offer a potted lavender plant as a peace gesture once. Karen slammed the door in his face. And then, one crisp April morning, everything changed. Daniel was roused by an unusual sound, metallic scraping, dull thuds, and the unmistakable rip of tearing roots. At first, still half asleep, he thought perhaps a storm had blown something over. He slipped on his sandals and stepped outside. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Karen was in his yard. Not just near the fence, in his garden, standing ankle-deep in a patch of upturned soil, yanking tomato plants from the earth with both hands like a madwoman possessed. A shovel lay beside her, its blade coated in soil and splattered petals. Lavender branches lay crushed underfoot. The trellis, once proud and clean, now leaned sideways like a wounded soldier. "Karen, what are you doing?" Daniel gasped, his voice trembling with disbelief. Karen didn't even flinch. She turned to him with wide, wild eyes and pointed an accusing finger. "You and this filthy mess are driving me crazy," she shrieked, her voice raw with rage. "I can't take it anymore. The smell, the bugs, the constant noise. It's disgusting. You turned this neighborhood into a jungle." Daniel stared at her, stunned, unable to process the destruction around him. Flowers he had planted from seed, vegetables he had nurtured, all lay in ruin. The jasmine vine was shredded at the root, its white blossoms scattered like snow across the grass. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't speak. His sanctuary, the space that had saved him from depression, from heartbreak, from himself, was being torn apart in front of him, and all he could do was watch. The warmth of the rising sun contrasted sharply with the cold rage seething in his gut. Karen, panting and red-faced, stomped back to her yard and slammed the gate behind her as if he had trespassed on her land. Daniel dropped to his knees in the dirt, numb. He picked up a broken lavender stem and let the crushed petals fall through his fingers. His hands shook, but not with sadness anymore, with fury. That day, something shifted in Daniel. The man who once turned the other cheek felt a new resolve rise from the ashes of his broken garden. Karen had destroyed his peace, but he wouldn't let her get away with it. Not this time. The morning after the destruction, Daniel stood on his back porch, arms crossed, eyes scanning the wreckage like a battlefield commander surveying the aftermath of war. His garden, the one he had lovingly crafted, now looked like a storm had torn through it. Torn roots, snapped branches, flattened flower beds. The scent of lavender was no longer calming but haunting. He took photos of everything, wide shots, close-ups, timestamps. He even filmed a slow video walkthrough with his phone, his voice tight and raw as he narrated the damage. He wasn't sure what he was going to do with the evidence yet, but he knew he needed it. Later that afternoon, Karen was in her yard again, pruning her already bare bushes like nothing had happened. Daniel walked over to the fence, not to yell or curse, but to demand an explanation. "You trespassed. You destroyed my property," he said calmly, though his hands were clenched behind his back. Karen looked up, her expression smug and unrepentant. "I did what had to be done," she said, her tone as if she were discussing taking out the trash. "You were ruining the neighborhood with that overgrown mess. You should thank me." She turned away before he could respond, as if the matter were closed. But it wasn't. Daniel knocked on the doors of two neighbors, Mrs. Lynn on one side, and an elderly couple across the street. Both had seen Karen in his yard. Both were willing to make statements. The next day, Daniel went to the local police station. He explained what had happened, showed them photos, videos, and witness names. The officer on duty, while sympathetic, shook his head and said, "This is a civil issue, sir. You'll need to go to small claims court." Daniel nodded. That was all he needed to hear. That evening, as he sat at his kitchen table filling out paperwork, he felt a strange sense of calm returning, not from the garden, but from the act of standing up for it. For once, he wasn't turning away from conflict. He was confronting it head-on. When he told friends what happened, reactions were mixed. Some laughed, "She ripped out your tomatoes." Others told him to drop it. "It's not worth the fight," they said. But Daniel knew better. This wasn't about plants anymore. It was about boundaries. About respect. About not letting someone bulldoze your peace just because they think they can. He filed the claim, paid the fee, and circled the court date on his calendar. Every day leading up to it, he passed by the garden and told himself, "This is worth it." Not because of the money or the plants, but because it was time Karen realized she couldn't just tear down what others had built. Not without consequence. The day of the court hearing arrived beneath a gray, overcast sky, and Daniel took it as a sign of seriousness. No sunshine, no distractions, just truth. He dressed carefully, in a simple navy button-down and khakis, not to impress, but to show respect. Clutching a folder filled with printed photographs, receipts for garden supplies, and sworn witness statements, he walked into the small municipal courthouse with his heart pounding like a drumbeat. Karen was already there, sitting confidently on the other side of the room in a beige pantsuit that matched her personality, bland, hard, and unyielding. She chatted idly with her lawyer, laughing as if she were attending a casual luncheon, not a legal proceeding. The room was modest, no more than 15 rows of benches, a podium, and a judge's bench that seemed far too large for the space. But to Daniel, it might as well have been the Supreme Court. When the clerk called the case, Miller versus Simmons, his palms turned clammy. But as he stood and made his way to the front, something in him shifted. He thought of the first time he saw his lavender bloom, how the garden had helped him breathe again after years of emotional suffocation. That resolve pushed his shoulders back. The judge, a stern but fair woman named Judge Harris, asked each party to state their claims. Karen went first. Her lawyer spoke on her behalf, painting Daniel as an obsessive, unruly neighbor whose overgrown botanical project had become a public nuisance. Karen nodded dramatically at every point, occasionally whispering into her attorney's ear as if she were feeding him lines for a play. But the judge was not impressed. Then it was Daniel's turn. His voice was steady, but quiet, and as he spoke, the courtroom seemed to lean in. He explained how the garden was more than just plants. It was therapy after loss, a symbol of growth after hardship. He presented his photos, before and after, laying them gently on the judge's bench like precious evidence of a crime. He showed receipts, explained the layout, even pointed out how every single plant had been on his property. "I never once crossed into her yard," he said. "But she crossed into mine. And she didn't just destroy flowers, she destroyed peace." The judge remained silent as she flipped through the photos, the contrast between blooming color and lifeless dirt impossible to ignore. After a long pause, Judge Harris looked up, her voice firm. "Mrs. Simmons, you may have had personal annoyances, but that does not entitle you to violate property lines and destroy someone else's hard work." Karen's face, once smug, now twisted into something pale and bitter. "You acted with malice," the judge continued, "and you will be held responsible." The judgment was swift. Karen was ordered to pay Daniel for the full cost of the damage, including emotional damages and legal fees. Daniel exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. As he left the courtroom, folder under his arm, he didn't smile in victory, he simply felt whole again. The first morning after the court ruling, Daniel stood in his backyard, the early sun casting long golden rays across the bare patches of soil that had once teemed with life. There was no celebration, no champagne or cheering crowd, just silence, calm and steady, like the first breath after a storm has passed. The judgment hadn't brought back the plants, the time, or the memories lost in Karen's destruction, but it gave him something far more powerful: validation. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't overreacting. His peace had mattered. And now, it was time to rebuild. He spent the next week clearing the debris and leveling the damaged beds. Friends who once told him to let it go now offered to help, showing up with bags of soil, seedlings, and coffee in hand. Mrs. Lynn brought cuttings from her own herb garden. The couple across the street gifted him a new bird bath, saying it was to bring the birds back, and hopefully some joy too. And Daniel, though still tired from the emotional toll, began to feel something unfamiliar stir inside him: hope. He ordered a new jasmine vine, the same type that once filled his evenings with scent and peace. This time, he planted it in a ceramic pot beside his window, as if to remind himself that beauty could always return, even if in a slightly different form. As spring deepened, the lavender returned, the tomatoes sprouted again, and the roses began curling open like shy dancers at the edge of the stage. He moved with more confidence now, digging, pruning, watering with a quiet gratitude he hadn't felt before. Karen, for her part, stayed silent. No apology came. Her windows remained shut. A "for sale" sign appeared in her front yard a few weeks after the court date, and though Daniel felt no joy in her departure, he felt a sense of justice. Some people leave not because they're forced to, but because they can't bear to stay in the shadow of their own wrongdoing. When the house eventually sold and the new neighbors moved in, they arrived with smiles and a toddler who waved at Daniel from across the fence. "We heard you have the best garden on the block," the young mother said with a laugh. Daniel smiled, not proudly, but warmly. "I'm just getting started," he replied. And it was true. The garden was different now. It held scars, yes, but also stories, strength, and roots deeper than before. In fighting for it, Daniel had rediscovered something in himself: resilience, dignity, and a quiet courage that would stay with him far longer than any season's bloom. As he knelt beside his jasmine one evening and breathed in its familiar fragrance, Daniel knew this wasn't just the end of a conflict. It was the beginning of something better.